Yeah, my name's Christopher Collison, and again today we're talking about clear, concise and compelling presentations. This is for CHEM 670, week 7, and we're going to jump in where we left off from the presentation from lecture 7a. So we're going to continue talking about presentation structure, and this was the outline we've been working through. And we're going to talk right now about the body of the presentation after the introduction. How do we present our slides? What's the most effective way of presenting those slides? And we're going to talk about a default slide organization that I'm going to provide you. And for each slide, I'm going to ask you to think about how we might respond to predictable questions from the audience. So let me just start with some general ideas about our default slide organization. So we've got to remember that every part of the slide is a response to a predictable question from the audience. The audience is asking us to tell them why this slide is here, or why a particular part is there from the presentation or from an individual slide. So write these slides in anticipation of your audience's questions. For example, in my example from the previous presentation, I anticipated a question that the audience would have, which would be, well, what is intermolecular charge transfer? So clearly I need to have part of my introduction or a slide that would tell them what intermolecular charge transfer was, and probably also why it's important. So use your outline that you've written, which is a plan of what's to come in your presentation, knowing what your solution is. Use that outline to consider what questions that audience might ask. So let's jump on right now to the default slide organization, and let's talk first about titles. It is so important in a title to put forward a claim, to put forward an idea that you're going to explore in the rest of the slide. So this claim answers already what the point of this slide is and why the audience is reading it. It shapes also how the audience understands the rest of the slide, and it clearly communicates the central concepts of that individual slide. So at that point, once you've made your claim, then the audience will find the rest of the body of the slide to be coherent. I advise you, look at examples in talks from your peers. Look at seminars that people give in weekly seminars in your department. Critically evaluate what they do, and we can do this and we can learn from it. That's the important thing about looking at other people's presentations. TED Talks, for example, are really important to watch because we can start to see what the presenters do well and what they don't do so well. With TED Talks, usually the presentations are very good. So that was titles, right? You're going to provide your claim. Subtitles introduce other themes, but really what subtitles do well is they point the reader to something very specific that addresses the claim in a slide that's dense with words, data, and images. So the subtitle answers the question, really, how is this slide organized? Maybe you need to show a lot of data, but you really want the audience to take away one particular aspect of that slide. So what key information or themes should the audience member look for? A subtitle is also a roadmap to the body of the slide. It's not simply a continuation of the title. It's helpful in science, in particular when the body is a chart or a graph or a diagram, and it tells the audience how or to find a particular part of that slide that really addresses the claim in the title. So that's subtitles. Let's have a look at an example, and I'm going to show you a presentation or a slide from a presentation that I've given, and it's quite a dense slide, but the important thing here is that we recognize that the title here provides a claim. So this squarane polymer spectra right? The spectra in this figure, they change at different weight ratios. So really what I'm saying is to the audience, look out, look at the weight ratios. The weight ratios are going to be found down here in the presentation, and see how those spectra change. That's what I'm saying in the claim of my title. Now, in this particular case, I have quite a busy slide. I've also got bullet points over here on the right-hand side, on the top right-hand side. A lot of information here, but the subtitle, broadening an appearance of a second hump as intermolecular distance increases, tells the audience really what I care about. Then the audience might recognize, oh yes, there's broadening in this spectrum, and there's also a second hump that starts to increase in here. And we start to recognize now that this is associated with intermolecular distances. These are these percentages, and later on the audience is primed to recognize a distance between particular molecules in this doped polymer. I don't give the whole context in this particular slide for the presentation I would have given, but the key here is that the example of this subtitle points the audience member to the key aspects of the slide that I want them to take away. So again, the body, right, is important because we have to develop the claim. We've set up a claim in the title, and it steers us to know what to put in the body of that slide. So really we're thinking to ourselves, how must this slide support the claim that's made in the title? Why should the audience believe the claim? You know, what data backs up the claim that's being made? The body also does a job by repeating themes and keywords from the title, and this helps again in coherence. Remember that the audience will find the slide more coherent and better organized when that data addresses that specific claim. So again, what happens here? Again, we can think about this claim in the title. These spectra change at different weight ratios, and as I've described previously, the figure explores or supports that claim. The data in the table supports that claim. I've also added in here something that repeats the idea. So these are spectra. These are normalized absorption spectra. We see a growing of this peak at around 600 nanometers. So this is this second hump. The spectrum is changing. I'm also asking the audience to think about a solution spectrum and a low concentration squarane film. This is more of the detail, so I can go into this later. It's added into the slide, but it's perhaps not so important because my subtitle says to the audience, don't worry too much about this. And I'm also saying here there's broadening in addition to the shoulder growth. Again, broadening is a form of spectral change. So I'm providing data to support the claim in the title. Next, I'm going to talk briefly about takeaway boxes. And takeaway boxes are really valuable if you want the audience to see something more from the slide that you've just shown them, if you want the audience to see something more from the data you've just presented. So what additional point should the audience member infer from the slide? What conclusion should the audience take from the slide? What's a core or lead message that they should take with them to the next set of slides? What new issue does this slide point the audience member to? If you want the audience to take a summary to the next slide with a takeaway box, of course, you have to follow through on that contract in a way. You have to, you're introducing new information and you have to develop in the next slide. And that's another form of chaining that we've come across in our writing. So how would a takeaway box fit in this slide? So I usually leave a little bit of space at the bottom of the slide in here, and I'll say, okay, here's the next idea we're going to explore in the next slide. What was the origin of this spectral change? So it ties back to the claim that I'm making, and it's suggesting that the following slides are going to address the origin of this change. So next up, we're going to follow through our outline, and we're going to talk about how to evaluate whether we think the presentation is a strong one or not. And so what we can think about is we have a deck of slides, a deck of cards if you like, but a deck of slides. a slide is part of that deck. So the slides, each individual slide must lend coherence to the whole slide deck. It must be part of the thematic string that carries through the presentation. Usually that's the problem and the solution that's introduced in the introduction. So when reviewing your own work, evaluate how well each slide contributes to the overall purpose. Think back to that major initial claim that was made actually in your introduction. So how do we, if we've written a presentation, how do we review our slides for coherence? And this is a good test that you can set up with a peer, with a friend. So it's a test for clarity and coherence. And let me take you through that now. So this final test for clarity and flow in your presentation. Collect together the titles of each slide in the deck. You might, for example, copy these to a word processor file. Then you want to collect the introduction from your deck, right? So that might be several slides, right? And any introductory slide for each major new section. Maybe you introduce a topic with an introductory slide at the beginning of that topic. So you want to collect those together. You've got to put your deck in order. So you've got to put the introductory slides in the right places before the appropriate sequence of titles, including any introductory slide from a particular section in your talk. Then give this document to a peer. This peer must be completely unfamiliar with the presentation and research, not someone from your research group who kind of knows what you're doing, but someone from outside of the research group who can give you some objective feedback. So then you ask that person to read what you've provided them and then give back to you a quick summary of the deck. You know that if you receive a summary that you don't expect, that means that they are going to have trouble understanding it. They have had trouble understanding it. It means that your audience also will have misunderstood what you've been trying to tell them. So that tells you go back and review your slides and start the process again. So to finish, to summarize, summary and general rules. So a general rule I'm going to provide for the first time here is when you're giving a presentation, another thing to do is tell the audience what you're going to tell them. Tell them roughly what the solution is at the beginning of the presentation. Then what you want to do is tell them what that solution is. This is where you diverge, you go into some significant detail in the main section, the main body of the presentation. And then at the end, just like I'm doing here, you summarize. Tell them what you've already told them, but in a single slide, in a single summary. Plan your presentations. Always important to plan your presentation. Figure out the goal of your presentation. Is it to get across a conclusion? Is it to impress someone? Is it to try to get a job? Think about your goal and think about the conclusion that you want to make and target your presentation for that goal. Use the claims in titles to provoke interest. This forces the audience to follow you as you support the claim in that particular title. So what's the point of each slide? That's what you have to ask as you're putting this slide together. Point to key ideas from dense data using subtitles. You may not always need to use a subtitle, but if you want to point to a particular piece of information, use a subtitle. And then use takeaway boxes if there's something really important that you want the audience to take with you or with them as they finish watching that particular slide. Ask friends to help when it really matters. When you're giving a really important presentation, ask your friends to step in and give you some objective feedback. Sum it all up in the end with a summary. And then finally, how do we finish a presentation with a nice clean finish? So how we can do this is providing an acknowledgement slides. I'm going to give you an example now of an acknowledgement slides. You can talk about the people that did the work. You can talk about your colleagues. You can also talk about a funding source. The important thing is that you finish well, and then finally thank the audience for their attention. This is how you close a presentation. that would be how I would typically close. I'm not done yet, because I want to provide you with some really good resources. There's a book called Talk Like TED by Carmine Gallo. In that book, Carmine Gallo talks about ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, the credibility of the presentation. Pathos, the pulling on the heartstrings, maybe the pragmatic problem in there, and drawing the attention of the audience, drawing the engagement of the audience. And logos, the flow, the coherence. So we've talked about that in these presentations, but we're now talking about them in 3 words: ethos, pathos, and logos. And Carmine Gallo also talks about the power of 3, having maybe no more than 3 key points to a particular slide, because we tend to remember numbers in 3s. We tend to remember things well in 3s. Another great book is called Make It Stick by Chip and Dan Heath, and they basically give this idea of success. It's an acronym: simplicity, unexpectedness, concreteness, credibility, emotions, and stories. We're always telling a story in our presentation. We'll talk about storytelling and how it makes for effective presentations in a subsequent talk that I'll provide in the next couple of weeks. So thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next time.